Welcome, everybody. My name is Tom Banchoff. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening around the world. I am Vice President for Global Engagement at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And on behalf of Georgetown, our co-host, the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and our convener, Northwestern University in Chicago, I'm really delighted to welcome you to this U7+ Roundtable on climate change, inequities, and intergenerational justice. Now, this is quite an experiment in real time. Last time I checked, we've got upwards of 80 participants from more than 20 universities in more than a dozen countries around the world, roughly split between faculty and staff and students. So truly an intergenerational conversation on a critical topic. I particularly want to welcome our colleagues and collaborators from the University of Cape Town. Over the past couple of months, we've seen the terrible images of wildfires that have threatened your city and your campus, and we want you to know that you have our full solidarity as you deal with the crisis and its aftermath. And of course, in this global state that we're in, I want to take the opportunity, and I'm sure you'll agree, to share our solidarity with those countries, communities, and especially individuals and families suffering through the ravages of the COVID-19 pandemic. A solidarity, again, I know we all share in a crisis that is far from over. All right, well, just a word of background on how we got here, this very diverse group of students, faculty, and administrators on our call today. You are all part of the U7+ Alliance, a network of global universities, 40+ institutions whose presidents came together for the first time 2 years ago in Paris, and then again virtually last year under the leadership of Northwestern University. Northwestern, which now houses the secretariat for this global organization. And I particularly want to recognize my colleagues, Annalise Riles and Megan Ozorowski, who are the drivers at Northwestern, and Megan in particular for masterminding this very complex and wonderful event we're all part of today. So one of the things that distinguishes the U7+, because there are lots of networks of universities globally, but one of the things that really distinguishes this, our network, is a commitment to research and teaching around the world's greatest challenges. And one of those great challenges is, of course, climate change. And one of the things that our universities can bring to bear, in addition to technical expertise, is an intergenerational perspective on the issues. We're all part of intergenerational communities, and I think you'll agree there's probably no challenge more pressing from that lens than climate change and its implications for equity and intergenerational justice. Now, this is the first of what we hope will be a series of such intergenerational roundtables. I want to highlight that this idea emerged from student leaders within the U7+, who convened the very impressive U7+ Worldwide Student Forum last June. The idea of intergenerational roundtables was endorsed by our university presidents at their summit this past November, which Northwestern hosted. And you'll have a chance in our breakout sessions to get to know some of our student leaders, as they'll be among the moderators. So just a word on our format. I think if you have the agenda before you, you know we're dividing our time into 3 parts. Again, very much an experiment. We look forward to the event and to your feedback as we move forward. We thought we'd start with some general perspectives that we'll all tune into. You'll hear from faculty and students both at Georgetown and at the University of Cape Town. Then the main event, if you like, will be breakout sessions, half an hour of conversation in smaller groups to go over some of the questions that will be addressed in the framing presentations and that you've received via email. And then we will, this will be the tricky part, reconvene as a large group, get readouts from the individual conversations, the small group discussions, and see what wider themes emerge. I'll go over the breakout sessions in a little more detail once we get to that point. But I would like now just to frame the overall event to go through the 3 questions that were sent to you in advance, just so we have them in the back of our minds as you hear the framing presentations. The questions are, in the context of climate change, of course, first, what do we owe to future generations, and how should we address trade-offs between economic prosperity in the present and near future and the well-being of future societies? Second, how does the principle of intergenerational equity relate to other principles enshrined in the Paris Agreement? And how can all of these principles be creatively realized together? And third, how can we effectively involve the participation of young people and the U7 Plus Alliance in wider conversations about equity and intergenerational justice amid the climate crisis? So, ready to move to our framing presentations. I want to thank you all again for being with us. And let's hear first from Joanna Lewis from Georgetown University.
All right, well, welcome everybody. So my name is Joanna Lewis. I'm a professor at Georgetown University in Washington, and I direct a program called Science, Technology, and International Affairs, which combines studies of science and technology with global affairs issues. My own research focuses on climate change, science and policy, particularly. I work internationally, both at the level of the international climate change negotiations, as well as in a lot of the major emerging economies and China in particular. So it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. And I just put together a few framing slides to set the stage of where we are. I don't think I need to convince anyone who's here today about the science and the severity of what we're seeing in terms of trends. 2020 was in fact the warmest year on record, or tied with the other warmest year on record. And we see this really dramatic increase over the last 2-3 decades in global mean average temperatures. And this, of course, is important now. You know, it's important, I think, that we're having this conversation today at the beginning of this decade, because in fact, the 2020s are what scientists refer to as the pivotal decade for addressing climate change. Essentially, you know, the end of this decade is the time by which we need to have reduced global emissions by around 45% to not rule out limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the level that scientists have, you know, pointed to as where, you know, we would need to restrict warming to this to avoid some of the most disastrous impacts of climate change. And of course, we are currently not on track, as I'll talk about, to meet that. But we have essentially this decade to really decide whether we're going to get on a low carbon pathway that could take us there. Now, of course, the global pandemic has brought a whole new set of challenges to the entire world. And 2020 was, in fact, to be the year that countries were due to announce their next round of Paris Agreement goals as we approach COP26. And that was scheduled to be at the end of last year, but because of the pandemic was delayed until November of this year. So in terms of, you know, the climate response, we unfortunately are already set back a year, but countries have still been hard at work. Many have in fact put forward in the next round of goals, as I'll talk about in a moment. And, you know, I think it's important, particularly for today's conversation, to remember that many who emit the least will be affected the most, right, in terms of emissions. In terms of impacts, right? So in terms of those who emit the least, this is just an illustration of cumulative carbon dioxide emissions per capita. There's obviously a lot of different metrics we can use to think about this, and this is just over a couple of decades. But of course, the major emitters don't tend to be the same countries always as the ones who will be affected the most by the impacts of climate change. This is a map by National Geographic, specifically showing the impact of climate change on national economy, measured by GDP. And of course, there's a variety of other impacts, health impacts, security impacts, non-monetary impacts as well. And I think very germane to our conversation today, of course, is the fact that climate impacts will exacerbate existing global inequities. Some of you may have read this report in preparation for today. And this is just a useful diagram, I think, highlighting, you know, specific areas that are extreme drought risk. We'll see extreme increases in hurricane and cyclone severity, heat stress, you know, all in the next few decades. And so these are really particularly, again, a lot of areas that are already dealing with a lot of other broader development challenges. So I want to turn to just the global ambition and the gap that we're currently facing. A lot of what I work on is, how different countries can implement policies to decrease their emissions, can transform their energy sector to low carbon economy. And you can see that this trajectory here is essentially, the path that we are on. This is sort of the path, that we would be on absent the pledges and targets that were taken by countries under the Paris Agreement. This is sort of where the old set, the original set of Paris pledges get you. And then we already see countries coming forward with their new nationally determined contributions to narrow this gap in ambition. And so, we're on the right track. Countries are increasing ambition. We're seeing a lot of important countries come forward. Most recently, of course, the United States, and President Biden, not only announced the United States would rejoin the Paris Agreement, but has just put forth the contours of the US pledge for the Paris Agreement, which is really quite dramatic and much more ambitious than even the initial targets that President Obama had put forward, about a decade ago. So, this is certainly, I think, a sign we're moving in the right direction, but this chart really does illustrate the dramatic gap that remains to, again, get to a 1.5 degree pathway, if that is indeed the goal. It really will still be quite a challenge to get there. You can see that in terms of the Paris Agreement, specifically 56 countries have submitted new targets that improve upon the initial ambition that they pledged back in Paris in 2015 or before. And you have still about 100 countries that have not yet updated their targets and are in the process in many cases of doing so. Many countries were in the process and then essentially had to refocus efforts in dealing with the COVID-19 response. And we now see actually some really interesting synergies, I think, between the response to the pandemic and climate policy, where we see, particularly as countries are putting forward economic stimulus packages, thinking about how to rejuvenate economic growth, doing this in a green, sustainable, low carbon way. And that can be a way to essentially help address some of the impacts of the pandemic and transition to a low carbon economy. The last thing I want to point out, and I know a lot of this will be our conversations today, is that there are a lot of ways that particularly younger generations can get involved. One of the things that I do here at Georgetown, in addition to teaching classes on climate science and climate policy and sustainable energy systems, is to try to integrate students into the international policy process and the international discussions that are taking place. So this is just a few photos over the years of different conferences. These are the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, annual climate change negotiations. Perhaps some of you have had the opportunity to attend these as well. This is, of course, not the only place that important conversations are happening, but it is the main international forum for negotiating future international climate treaty and the follow-on to the Paris Agreement, the Paris Rulebook. So this is something that we've been doing since I started at Georgetown, and I've been doing this long before that, since I was a student, actually a graduate student, and attended my first COP. And so, this is just a really great way to really get up to speed with, what are the challenges in these negotiations. I think sometimes we get frustrated when we understand the pace at which policymakers are moving on this issue. I know particularly many of my students feel that way. And then when you attend a global negotiation of 190 plus countries trying to sit around a table and come to agreement, you realize just the real challenge, the diversity of views, and the importance of including all these different voices with very different perspectives, but then the challenge of actually coming to an agreement when everyone has such different perspectives on this. Unfortunately, though, we don't have a lot of time. So, I think the question is sort of how do we balance this? How can we most effectively get involved in pushing the conversation forward? So I will stop there, and I look forward to our conversation and discussions this morning. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joanna, for that wonderful overview. Let's move now to Tyler and Kawali.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kwaile Munaheng. I'm a student at the University of Cape Town, also part of the African Climate Change Developmental Initiative. So I'm a master's student here. I'm originally from Lesotho, but I'm studying here in South Africa. So I like the previous presentation by Joanna when she talked about the fact that these climate risks and these experiences will not be distributed evenly. We know the science is quite clear, particularly for us here on the African continent, and I think that's also the story for most developing countries, that we are already experiencing some of the worst climate impacts and risks right outside our front doors. I think one fact that remains here is when the rest of the world is going through, I think, a 1.5 warming or a 2-degree warming, here, particularly in Southern Africa, that we're heating twice at that global rate. And that also has its several implications as to health issues, agriculture, our livelihoods are completely affected by this. And that these are critical things that were in the developed world. These are just more environmental issues. In Africa, it's more to do with our very survival. And I think that's also true for a lot of countries. So vulnerability indexes as well need to be adjusted. Risk indexes as well need to be adjusted to sort of include us in the conversation. And I think Joanne also mentioned this ideology of other people being able to attend these conferences. Unfortunately, here in Africa, we do not have that luxury to be able to travel to the UNFCCC or be able to participate at that higher level. These are things that even within our own societies, learning about climate change is actually a privilege. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to be sharing these experiences with you. I think a big thing on our part is that we are already living through these risks and we're already going through these impacts. And I think they're already affecting our livelihoods. And when you think of the multiplier effect that's already happening to us, that it's not just climate, it also goes on to affect health. It also goes on to affect livelihoods here on the African continent. And actually found quite an interesting study that was conducted in Nature just about the 2015 Paris Agreement, looking at the issue of equity. And it had two aspects that really stood out for me, where it says that they found a systematic bias in the fair share quantifications of the global climate action, right? The first is effort sharing, determining of fair shares by countries and how to divide up the global carbon budget equally, as well as the second one where countries are asked to show how their nationally determined contributions are fair. The second aspect would be comparing the NDCs against the fair share as calculated in many studies which compare these two aspects, right? So that initial study conducted by one of the professors here at UCT, Harold Winkler, sort of talks about this idea that we need to promote transparency and we need to look at this idea of ethics within these studies where we think about our neutral position in climate, because the position isn't neutral to begin with. Yeah, I think that's just my input here. Just speaking from experience, and I just need to just reiterate that fact that these risks aren't evenly distributed. So I think Tyler will take over from here to deal with point number 3. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kwali. Yes, I'm going to talk a bit more on the youth participation side, given my experience, which is quite extensive in terms of the youth advocacy side. So I'm involved with an organization called the Youth Policy Committee, and that's based in South Africa, and it's basically a coalition to involve or a group of young people from various different organizations that basically our goal is to comment and give the youth input on policy. So I'm the focal point for the climate change working group, but I'm also leading a national process that we're calling the Youth Climate Action Plan, which is furthering the work we've done as the YPC over the past few years to create some sort of a policy document that young people are asking not only policymakers, but scientists, academia, civil society, the business world, what we want in terms of climate action in the country. And in order to do this process, we actually started up with what we called the Johannesburg Youth Climate Action Plan. And why I want to talk about that is it's quite a landmark way of incorporating youth voices in policymaking. So typically when young people are engaged, or when civil society engages in a policy document, you basically submit your comments and then they're either taken up or not taken up. The transparency, sometimes we're not quite clear of how much of that is taken up, because the timelines that we're seeing right now, if we look at the climate change bill in South Africa, was released in 2018 and we're yet to see a final version being tabled at Parliament. So we're not quite sure where, how much, to what extent our inputs are being taken up. But why this Johannesburg Youth Climate Action Plan is so important is that it took that notion of just submitting comments one step further. We approached, with the help of the Global Change Institute at the University of Witwatersrand, with their support and the lobbying from Professor Colleen Vogel, also a climate scientist. With her support, we lobbied the city to have a youth input in the document. So basically we wrote like a section of the climate action plan that they're releasing on the 3rd of June. We've just been told that today, that it's releasing on the 3rd of June. But the youth voice wasn't affected by the adults at all. It was guided, and sometimes we were asked questions and we were pushed, but we did all the drafting and the connecting and that. And some of the principles that we looked at are also related to equity and the Paris Agreement. Some of the other questions here is that we looked at intersectionality. That's one of the key things we're interested in, and how it's not just about climate change, and it's not just about gender-based violence, about how these things are going to affect each other. And not even to that extent, if we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, how is that also being affected, and how are persons of color going to be affected by climate change? So we're trying to tackle some of these complex things. And then at the same time, given the South African context, we realized that the system is broken. Our energy system is broken. There's a lot of corruption. There's so many problems, and what we were asking for is systems change. And through that, we're looking at the topics of decolonization, but then also somewhat innovation and advocacy within that, and allowing people to help change the system and young people. Then I think one of the key principles that I think is important for equity is that of education and awareness, and then also the relationship of advocacy. And in terms of education, we need formal and informal education. But yeah, so there's a whole bunch there. I hope that we could share and I can discuss it a bit more later. But also to touch on what Joanna said is, and Koali, about being able to attend international conferences such as COP. I was actually fortunate and given the opportunity to attend COP25. And it's quite an interesting platform to go from being an activist and fighting your government to fighting alongside your government for change. Just to share my sentiments on that. But I look forward to engaging a bit further later. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Tyler and Quali, for sharing your perspectives. Let's go now to Olivia.
Hello, everyone. I hope my computer started working. I recently was having some trouble with it, so bear with me. But thank you all for being here today. Thank you to Georgetown, to Northwestern, to Cape Town University for putting this together, and U7 as well. I am a junior at Georgetown University in our School of Foreign Service. I'm majoring in the program that Professor Lewis talked about, Science, Technology, and International Affairs. And I kind of wanted to talk about first my introduction into environmental justice and how I became involved in climate change. And at Georgetown, we have this unique program that allows us to take one topic, but kind of interdisciplinary. So I was able to take a course titled Disability, Ethics, and Eco-Justice for half the semester. And then the other half, I took a course titled Climate Change and Global Justice. And the first half was talking about religion and intersecting with climate change, whereas the second half was talking about intergenerational equity and the burden that we have and who's going to pay for climate change, essentially. And this was really my first introduction into talking about how the environmental justice and the complexity of addressing climate impacts across different communities. Specifically looking at the disabled community, we discussed how often this community is forgotten during extreme weather event emergencies, yet because of their already failing infrastructure, this community actually needs some of the most support during extreme weather events. And so we talked about how the words that we're actually using to describe our environmental movements and just simply describing wilderness, such as pristine or untouched, overshadows the need to address environmental impacts within cities, namely how communities of color within cities are disproportionately bearing the impacts of environmental degradation and pollution. And I think what's important for today is how we critically examined whose voices are present and those that are not at the table in policy decisions. And talking about whether that's youth, communities of color, indigenous communities, how do we incorporate these voices in our discussions about policy and about mitigation and adaptation strategy? In the second half of the semester, I really talked about climate change and global justice. And I had the opportunity to actually interview one of my aunts who is 2 decades older than me. And we talked about these differences in our understanding of climate change and the generational gaps that exist. And so when she first heard about climate change, her first thought was that it didn't exist. There were no apparent changes in her neighborhood, so how could climate change be real? But as she grew older, she began to notice notable changes across the country, and traveling really opened her eyes to these disparate impacts. In contrast to my aunt's experience in her generation, my generation is growing up with living the impacts of climate change. I grew up with classes dedicated to climate change and school-wide initiatives to conserve water, pick up trash. Throughout the year though, I was living in California, so we would experience widespread droughts, or we'd have to wear masks to school to protect ourselves from the ash in the sky from the wildfires. This was no longer a distant idea as it had been for Judy's generation. Rather, this was climate change being lived every day. And I think this is really important because right now we need to be having discussions about the urgency of climate change and creating comprehensive frameworks, such as the planetary health law approach that the Lancet report suggested. Because currently, we're going to be facing a massive migration. By 2050, 1 billion people globally will need to relocate due to environmental degradation. Yet, this example shows that there is little recognition and protection under international law for environmentally displaced persons. We really need to be developing these integrated frameworks to ensure that communities around the world are supported and that they have the resources necessary when they are forced to relocate or when they're facing the disparate impacts of climate change on their community. And talking about intergenerational equity, we need to begin discussing who bears the burden for climate change. Specifically addressing how high-income countries have been the ones responsible for the majority of pollution and environmental degradation. We need to be shifting attention towards how do we support low and middle income countries so that they have the infrastructure and resources necessary to combat climate change. And considering the interconnected nature of this issue, how human rights law, economic and social factors, and these disparate impacts, we need to be integrating planetary health law into our discussions and talking about how do we kind of find the gaps and fix those gaps in our current existing frameworks. And so going back to what my aunt talks with me about, we can't keep passing this issue down to future generations, or else there won't be another generation to pass to. We can choose our path for the future, and to efficiently working together across generations, we can protect the environment and ensure a world where my generation, the future generations, are not the last to have access to fresh air and clean water. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Olivia. And our last speaker is Bretta.
So thank you very much. So my name is Bretta Renkamp. I'm a researcher at the University of Cape Town. I work at the African Center, African Initiative for Climate and Development. Yeah, so I just wanted to add to the discussion in terms of generational justice. There are a lot of injustices that come with climate change, obviously. So we have a project where we're looking into inequalities and climate action and how we can link those two. And just wanted to share a few ideas from the way that we think about inequality and justice. So in terms of the questions that Tom had prepared for us, there is an idea of a we, like what do we owe future generations, and how should we address trade-offs between prosperity in the near future and future societies. So the idea is around the we is very important. It's very critical to think about who the we is and who, what sorts of we's do we have in this game and how we address them. So that's what we think of as distributive justice, right? So distributive justice and the idea of who gets what in terms of environmental resources and in terms of the benefits of a healthy planet. So our thinking around this has changed because we don't actually just think in terms of natural resources being endless and being there. They are depletable, and it's become and turned into a zero-sum game. We know that they're ending, and now whether we need to think about how do we make sure that we share them. So that's the idea of distributive justice. The next concept relating to that is the idea of recognitional justice. So that comes along the we. I think by this invitation, I officially count as the older generation now. So what do we leave to the future generation, to the unborn life, and how vulnerable are they in this game, right? So there's us currently on the up of this, there's the elderly, who also have their responsibility. And then there's the future generations, and we almost have to think around the social intergenerational contract. I think there are discussions around, I've picked up around the pandemic, right? So there was a responsibility also for the youth to protect the elderly who turned out to be a bit more vulnerable to this. So now climate change brings the opposite, right? The older generations won't, might still, but won't feel that much of an impact, have some sort of responsibility, and also need to think about what they can do for the future generations. So it's that intergenerational contract that might lead us towards some sort of action that could be addressed in a joint way. And that brings me to the last point, which is the procedural justice. So obviously, the people who you've all met at the various COPs are in a certain generation. They are professionals. They, there are hardly any children there. Sometimes they come and sing. I saw them singing in Bonn. So there is an awareness raising of that, but the elderly are retired. So in a way, it's a certain generation that is currently actively participating in these negotiations. There's a question around ombuds people. Some countries have them already. So some countries in their parliaments, they have ombuds people who represent the interests of future generation and unborn life. There is some elements of that in the international negotiations yet, but they are still rare, and they're not here in Africa, for example. So there's some European countries who have that. So there's that big question about process and representation that leads to intergenerational justice in the overall. There was another question that Tom asked us around the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement is basically trying to do justice to everybody who's vulnerable, all vulnerable groups, also those who Olivia mentioned, is trying to make it work for all. It also links up very closely with the SDGs, the SDG climate action goals, and to basically leave no one behind. So how does that work? And the last point I want to make very quickly, I think, is in the key is to climate finance. It's not stated in the Paris Agreement, but climate finance is, we have the $100 billion goal per year, and we're very far away from it. And that is going to be very key. So in terms of what kind of finance can be mobilized now, what kind of finance will be available for protecting the resources that are critical for future generations. So I think there is hope that the millennials, there's evidence that the millennials are already doing wiser investment choices. So whoever has money should invest it in a conscious way. And then the questions about investments into climate sensitive goods and how those could be protected for the future. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to email you my slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Britta. We'll look forward to the slides. And thank you for your presentation and to all of our presenters for helping to frame our discussion. So let's start with group number one. And I've got Marco Rupp here as the student leader.
Yeah, hi everybody. I will be just brief from our group because we didn't have enough time to cover everything. I think it was a general problem. But yeah, for the first discussion question, we say we want to get away from the assumption that the change is going to be that expensive, more to the point of that there will be economic opportunities and yeah, away from this false presumption of cost in general. We also said that subsidies in most of the countries for fossil fuel, for example, could be labeled as criminal. And it is even really important to take those subsidies away and re-subsidize them to climate change opportunities in general with removements, for example. And we also acknowledge that many governments, if there is a governmental change in countries, don't even know with subsidized systems there were from the government before them. So we also acknowledge that there need to be communication. And there need to be winners and losers. There will be in this discussion. So we need to acknowledge that and have a clear message about the trade-offs, where lying the opportunities. We also have had an interested point for one of our discussants that, for example, indigenous people in some countries, they base their longer decisions on 7 generations. So we thought, why are not some governments doing that? Or why is not the economic system doing that? And framing is an important point of economic impact and economic reasons we labeled as well. And for the second discussion question,
sorry, Marco,
we said
Marco, I have to interrupt you there just in the interest of time. But you got us through one question with wonderful observations. Thank you for being a student leader. The first several moderators are all student leaders within the U7. And with that, let's move to Justin for insights from your group. Just 1 minute, please. Yeah.
Okay. Hello, my name is Justin, and I'm a student leader for the U7. We had a very broad range of expertise in our group, ranging from engineering to mathematics to music to political science. And so we had a very interesting conversation about CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility, and kind of this tension between developed countries and developing countries. And we had a short discussion about kind of trying to avoid paternalism and trying to say, and from the global north. We also had a short conversation about Bitcoin and its impact on an artificial intelligence and its impact on climate change in light of the recent Dogecoin and Bitcoin revelations. And so that we also talked about Google and their use of electricity and their contribution to global climate change.
Thank you, Justin. Valeria?
Hello. So our group also echoes the first 2 groups. We were able to get through all 3 questions, so I'll kind of give some brief insights from each one. The first question, it was interesting. We were discussing how it's important to properly define the question. So for example, how in the present, there shouldn't be so much focus necessarily on just the economic, but that there are also social and environmental concerns of the present even. And so that was kind of interesting to discuss. And then we also touched on similar things that Marco mentioned in terms of the fact that eco-friendly policy doesn't always damage the economy and that it can actually have a good influence. So that was for the first question. For the second one, we discussed how we do the consequence calculations. How far do we go in terms of future generations in our planning ahead, and the fact that it's important to have everyone at the table, as many different countries and different people from various communities at the table, different age groups, and how that allows us to effectively have different angles to tackle the problem of climate change. And for the third question, we were also discussing the importance of paying attention to people from other countries. So not just being self-centered in how we reflect on things, and then to kind of juxtapose that against, also thinking locally first and how that's important to giving insight, the importance of education for young people to be aware of the issues of climate change and involving the youth. Thank you.
Thanks, Valeria. We're really multiplying insights on these questions. Arjun.
Yeah, thank you. We had a fascinating discussion. Sadly, it was too short, but anyway, we packed in a lot in there. So one of the things we spoke about was the need to work at different levels. So right from the higher education level where we're all involved, right? Where we actually do get to see future generations. We have to look them in the eye and discuss these issues, right? Right from there till upper higher levels, like at the international diplomatic level, right? Dealing with this issue and having discussions on different levels. The need for research, both to talk about dangers in our current approach, but also solutions going forward, and how that research needs to be interdisciplinary, both in terms of the perspectives at universities, but also integrating the other stakeholders like the policymakers, the civil society groups much earlier on in the process as opposed to the end. We spoke about the importance of looking at the past to learn about lessons going forward in the future, and how things like domestic law and tribunals can also play a part within countries, and how the Paris Agreement is just one of many tools. And finally, we just spoke about how in forums like U7, it's a great start, but sometimes it still can feel pretty small, and it would be nice to sometimes have more than 5-6 students engaging. People are not just experts, but even people who are just interested in learning more. We should try and find ways to integrate some of those voices into the conversation as well.
Thank you. Excellent points. Let's move on to Femi.
So for Femi, it's me who will speak about what we discussed during the group. So we thought that we owe to the future generation to perform our international engagement with mostly a human rights approach and allow developing country economy a sustainable development with long-term benefits. We have to make a precedent with a strict legal norm and think pragmatically on considering the difficulty to ask a common and a world way of life. We have to protect our generation with law and climate litigation. We also spoke on how to be able to teach people to live better with maybe less. Is it possible? And at the end, we spoke about some incompatibilities on objectives, which have to be thought in order to be really effective.
Thank you very much. Yvonne.
Yeah, so we had a really great conversation too, with a lot of voices represented from different countries. And so some of the main takeaways were, one, there was a consensus that we need to move away from framing the conversation as a trade-off. Doesn't necessarily need to be, but we also need to expand the conversation and thinking just within the next generation. Like someone talked about thinking about 100 or 200 timeline. And so that's the first point. And then the second one was that it is clear that there's global inequities. And so how can we encourage countries or institutions to kind of take their own fair share of addressing emissions? Like what are the incentives there to do that? The third one was youth as a whole is not a homogenous group, which was an interesting point. So how we frame and consider as young people, they don't have a single voice, they have multiple voices. So how can we properly include all of these diverse voices just from the youth. And the last one is getting young people to understand decision-making process early so that they can get in early to share their concerns. So those were some of the big takeaways.
Thanks very much. Let's move to your group, Annalise.
So Kethra Campbell-Heaton is going to represent our group.
Hi. So we had a really great conversation, and some of the takeaways that we came out of our conversation was that creating a university pledge that's between universities so that we can all have the same standard of, or we all have the same mindset towards global climate change. Creating a university or a fund for those countries that are low-income countries, or to fund basically climate initiatives. And creating more links between the university and the community level, and really encouraging local initiatives and interdisciplinary work, as well as working in the classroom and really encouraging your students to think about how they can combat climate change on a local scale, because when you start small, you know, everything can get better from there, basically. And really engaging citizens as well as university students, but everybody else in the community. And a really cool one was including youth in the decision-making, not just making them a side panel, but getting them right in the nitty-gritty stuff and getting them in the decision-making, which would be fantastic if we could.
All right, thanks so much.
And finally, changing your behavior.
Sorry, we lost you there. The final point was about changing behavior. Are you still there, Kethra? Yeah. All right. Thanks very much.
Yeah, that's a little unstable, but yeah.
No, we got it. We got it all. Sounds like a great conversation. Thank you so much. Ahmed.
Yes, hello. Actually, I'm going to punt it to Jorge from our group to present his thoughts.
Oh, thank you. Good. Hello, everyone. So in our group, we discussed mainly about how can education play an important role in this problem. And we were thinking about mainly promoting starting the education from even elementary school, so we can start teaching the kids how they can protect their environment, but also while having fun. So apart from that, we talk about the strategies and actions, and we made a relationship with from that field with future design. So from our society right now, we need to start teaching not only adults, but also we need to start planning how our society will be formed in the future, and how our small actions can also be translated into all the effects that we will make into the environment in the future. So, well, it's all about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's move now to Dylan's group.
Okay, so I will be presenting for our group. And so with regard to the first question, we spoke about enforcement, and we looked at this from the legal perspective and how we can make sure that these principles are enacted. We looked at a clear example of what happens when we overlook problems in the present and how they may affect societies in the future. And this was the case of a petrochemical site being close to a community, and some of the future generations that did come up. And then we looked at the case of, instead of waiting for society to have its, in terms of growth, because we believe that growth would stop at a certain point. So we looked at it in terms of, instead of waiting for that moment, how can we start rethinking our economic system? And as Yvonne mentioned, we try to look at the issue of climate change, we drew away from looking at it in terms of a trade-off, and we looked at it in terms of an economic issue and how we can embrace it as a means for a progressive agenda. And that we believe that it could serve as a great opportunity to tackle a lot of the issues facing society. In terms of the question of the intergenerational issues, looked at the principle in the Paris and respective capabilities. And instead of just focusing on it in terms of the geographical approach, we wanted to look at it in terms of the age variations. And then we also highlighted on the case of intersectionality and how that is important to the conversation of climate change. And for the last question, we looked at the pivotal role of NGOs and the kind of social pressures that can arise in their role in terms of creating change. And then we had the perspective of pressuring the older generation to become more activist and to take risks, and instead of so having the younger generation kind of pivot this message. And we also looked at what is happening right now in terms of supporting each other and getting to know different perspectives to make sure that what we're bringing about is really rich in information. So if we're having exchange from different countries and different ages, it does add to the quality of the information that we are receiving. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's move to Tyler.
Thank you. So our group spoke more generally across the three topics. So one of the key things we focused on was a bit about the education, and that in the university space, perhaps the one suggestion was for a study major or discipline across universities, and that there's an exchange program part of that. But then I said, well, what about how does that reach a wider variety of people beyond those just studying? So perhaps the suggestion could be that people studying a major involved in climate science should have a component of their degree, which is to talk to local communities and engage with them as part of their research. Then we also spoke about the divide between different contexts in the developing and the developed. So if we look at Africa versus Europe or America, or what are the accessibility limits in terms of education, and is formal education and a formal curriculum the only way to go? So for some places, yes, and for other places like South Africa, no. So one of the solutions that was put forward was perhaps targeting climate education through media channels, mass media, TV, books, comics, all the works is popularizing climate change and climate action. And that part of this shouldn't only be teaching young people to save the planet, but also I think, as Yvonne's group and Kethra's group had mentioned, is that how do you teach them those skills to actually interact? So you've told you need to save the planet, but I think we need to take it one step further. Okay, well, this is how you do it. This is how you interact with the policy. This is how you interact with the decision-making spaces. And then I think the final aspect we spoke about was more the social side of climate change, and how you can get to these communities and you can reach a larger audience through talking through the culture, the religion, and the national identity, and ensure that the climate action is placed in those contexts. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Ulysses.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for these great discussions. So my group really focused on making efforts visible in terms of communication. We think it's truly important. But we also talk about the pandemic and the assets it gives us in thinking on the way forward, and the importance of creating partnerships, because we really realize that efforts should be done from students, but also from the administration in creating this first intergenerational link. So this can be done, for instance, through a connection of the university within the community through first-hand experiences, which are very inspiring for students, but also to strengthen the link between students and administrations to reinforce this cooperation, to develop forthcoming projects for a transition towards a greener and fairer future. And lastly, we really talked about the difficulty to identify barriers between generations, and the fact that I think that was Lee and I all in the same boat, and really thinking about common engagement and the developments and the efforts we have to do through this. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Olivia, what about your group?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I recognize the time. But we talked a lot about the first question and kind of framing it in terms of, should we really be talking about climate change as a future issue, considering that right now, climate change is happening to communities around the world. And so if we continue thinking about how do we help future generations, we kind of obscure how we should be helping our generation right now, and talking about like that the earth already has been in a very worse state than it was for past generations. And so I think we, in effect, are the future generation that we were talking about 2 decades ago, and now we're having to face the reality of the lack of action. And so instead of framing it always thinking about how do we help the future, but how do we help the communities today that are being hit the hardest, and then how that help in setting up frameworks that last will then in effect help future generations. So how the work that we do today to help current generations will affect and help future generations. And really talking about how our planet now, we're living in it's not like one generation's living on the planet and then the next generation comes. Rather, we're living with multiple generations all interacting, and how everyone's being affected by climate change in different ways, with heat waves disproportionately affecting older generations, and how future generations are probably going to face climate migration at greater rates. So really talking about how we should be focusing today, which will then help future generations.
Thank you, Olivia. And Britta?
Yes, many thanks. We had a good mix of developing and developed countries. So there were quite a few issues that came up around education, the need for bursaries. So we want U7 bursaries on climate change and intergenerational futures. And then basically more education and research and understanding the different vulnerabilities that come with multiple generations populating the planet and wanting to preserve it. And there was an interesting contribution from Japan saying basically how there's a lot of climate impacts already, and some sort of awareness, but it often also flips with ignorance. So the question is then also in terms of denial, how one can get better prepared, and how that preparedness can be sustainable. And similar contributions from Ghana and Kenya in terms of pollution and preserving water and air resources. And one last clue on technology, but also governance. Many countries actually have some sort of intergenerational clause in their constitutions, and South Africa definitely has it. In Germany, there were some NGOs that currently got the right to sue the government against the climate law because it rejects that principle. So it would be worth checking your respective constitutions if you have a clause against it, because that might help to protect the right of future generations to sustainable development and the use of resources as they are at the moment. So that's from our side. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent points. And last, we've got Anna.
Perfect, thank you. So my group also talked about future generations, and we talked about how the circular economy is an important step forward, and either that's through also biomimicry and urban design, but a challenge with circular economy is convincing people in rural and urban areas that it's not all about economic prosperity, but also about reconnecting with the natural world and having that value-based approach to dealing with climate change issues. And that value-based approach can be implemented through sustainability education, not only in university settings, but in primary and secondary education. And then we also talked about how the value-based approach is present in family dynamics, and that's something worthwhile to look at, and small community engagement. And lastly, we talked about in the governance sphere, how political institutions focus primarily on the short term, but climate change issues are on this long term scale. And one way of combating
economic challenges is through changing consumer behavior, but that's also a slippery slope because of greenwashing and similar approaches. So yes, those are some of the key points. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thanks to all of you. I'm only giving myself 1 to 2 minutes. I got to be fair here to wrap things up. We're right at 10:30 Eastern time. The time went by quickly. I can tell you, we can all tell the conversations went very well. They were limited by time, and time is a real constraint. Even if we had time for a larger plenary with 60, 70 people, it would be difficult. So we're going to get back to you in terms of getting your feedback on the format, how we can improve this going forward, enrich the conversation. This is really the first such intergenerational roundtable. I want to again acknowledge our student leaders for their leadership and pushing the university presidents to open up this space. And today we've had a good wide-ranging conversation. We're going to document it. We're going to share it with you. We're going to get you a good accounting of all these ideas that have come out just over the last 25 minutes or so. And we'll also share with you details about the next intergenerational roundtable in this series, to be hosted by Sciences Po in France and the Mohammed VI Polytechnic University in Morocco. So stay tuned for those details. And finally, as you know, as you can tell, a lot of technical know-how and experience and hard work went into this. So I want to thank the Northwestern team in particular, Megan for her outstanding work, Annalise and the whole team there. Thank you all for joining. Everyone's very busy. It's a busy time of year. And know that this is just the beginning. We're very grateful and we look forward to next steps together. So thank you very much.